Mute your microphones. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward, tumultuous planet. I'm Andy Revkin from the Earth Institute at Columbia University, longtime journalist. I put the poster behind me today from the 1994 HBO film that was based on my book, The Burning Season, that came out in 1990 about the murder of Chico Mendes, a rubber tapper in the Amazon rainforest. It's 30 years ago this month was when that book came out. And boy, those of us who've been at this a long time, this all feels so deja vu-ish to see the violence and disruption from the rainforests to the streets. One thing we're going to be talking about here today is indigenous impacts of the coronavirus, which has spread in just now half a year, from November, December, somewhere in China, to depths of the Amazon rainforest, and obviously the streets of New York and everywhere. And there are people who are most vulnerable tend to be the people who are least empowered and obviously poorest. And Indigenous Lives Matter hashtag has been trending of late for obvious reasons. And I've got a wonderful collection of people who've assembled for this hour from around the planet, mostly from the New York region here, but Mexico City and Guyana also in South America. And you'll meet them in a minute. So let's get started. The headlines this week included the one, sadly, of the death of Paiakan, Paulino Hayek, who in the 1980s was one of the pioneering faces of indigenous world, getting on magazine covers and making the case that the mining and deforestation in parts of the Amazon were not just imperiling the trees and biodiversity, but imperiling people. And that struck me again powerfully. I'm sure it did to Scott Wallace, who's here from National Geographic. We have Michael McGarrell, who is a member of the Patamano peoples in Guyana. Michael, could you correct me? Because I'm sure I'm incorrect.
Patamona.
Patamona. And Camila Osorio, who has written some pieces recently for The New Yorker. She's a journalist from Colombia, the country, not Columbia University. Or did you go to Columbia? I should ask. And she's been covering indigenous issues, including the recent death of an Ecuadorian elder. And Andalucia Soloff, who's in Mexico City, did a very powerful piece that caught my attention, I think it was last month, for NBC on the impact on Mexican indigenous immigrants in New York City of dealing with the coronavirus. And Chuck Nice, who is a good friend and one of the best science communicators I know, who's got a deep heart and a soul focused on social and environmental issues, is here briefly at the beginning of this broadcast to remind us of the other issue of our moment here, Juneteenth, and the impacts on other marginalized communities, whether they're now enslaved or not, or just enslaved by the architecture of society. So Chuck, could we just start briefly with you? And I'm going to ask everyone to sort of say how you're doing. So Chuck, how are you doing? It was way back in March, I think, when I was just starting this thing, you came on.
Yeah, right at the beginning of the pandemic and the shutdown. And since then, I have been lovingly quarantined in my home under house arrest with my family. And, a lot of people complain that they're stuck in the house with their family. I, for one, I absolutely have loved being stuck in the house with my wife and kids. And the only thing that could have made it better as if I didn't have to do it with my wife and kids. So, do they share your sense of okayness, or are you driving them crazy? All I can tell you is this: they make me sleep outside, Andy.
Okay,
so that should let you know how they feel about it. We have certainly seen a lot of turmoil since this. The one good thing that may come out of this pandemic is a rise in awareness, a cultural awareness, a social awareness. The one thing that may come out of this is a elevation of consciousness surrounding the systemic and endemic social ill in America that has been pervasive since the founding of this nation, and that is racism, or what I call the spectrum of bigotry and hate. Racism is not just I don't like somebody because they are. That is not what racism is. And I think that we have to change the way that we talk about it, and that we have to understand that it is on a spectrum of bigotry and hate. Racism is just one of the bands on that spectrum. And systemic racism is how bigotry and hatred has been baked into our society, our means and ways of governing our country. And I think because we were all forced to be home, we were all forced to watch a horrific event that unfortunately happens far more often than people even now even still recognize, that people kind of stood up and said, what the hell is going on? And that may be one of the best things to come out of this if it's sustained. This is the first time I can remember in my life that anyone has ever talked about Juneteenth.
Yeah, I know.
And it's certainly precipitated by the events, the horrible events that happened with the murder of George Floyd and the shooting of Rayshawn in the parking lot of the Wendy's. So, you know, I think that these issues as they arise, Juneteenth itself, for anybody who doesn't know, of course, is the official end of slavery 2 years after, so 1863, 1865, yeah, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas, which was the furthest state where slaves were being still enslaved people, which, by the way, I'm training myself, and it's still difficult not to do, is never to say slaves. Slaves are objects. Slaves are chattel. Enslaved people were suffering the atrocities of the American system of commerce, where owning another human being built the foundation of not only this country, but the global economy of that time. So enslaved people in Texas finally received the word through General Granger or Colonel Granger, a Union soldier who read the proclamation that they were indeed free. And people say, well, what is the big deal? The big deal is that even at that time, 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, there were many states who were like, no, because they saw Lincoln as not my president. So even back then, you had the hashtag not my president, and there were people who were refusing to acknowledge the Emancipation Proclamation. And so for many years, Juneteenth has been something that's recognized in the Black community as an official observance. And I think the horrific events that we all witnessed just recently has brought it to the greater consciousness. And I think it's a good thing, because it may change the conversations that we need to have around race. And it may start to lessen the uncomfortable nature of these conversations.
Yeah.
Because one of the biggest problems is that we start to talk about it and people start to feel like, man, why we got to talk about this? I don't feel this way. I'm not like this. And it's because it is a difficult conversation, but it doesn't really have to be. I'm a person who loves science. And the reason why I love science is that empirical data doesn't have an opinion.
Right.
Empirical data just is. And, facts and history can be the same thing. You don't have to adopt guilt and discomfort around the issue of America's past, because when you do, it makes you kind of feel like, well, I have to defend it, or I have to divorce myself from it, or I have to distance myself from it and say, well, that's not me, or I didn't do that, or any of that. And the truth is, you don't have to do that. What we can all do as a beginning is understand our history, understand that this happened, and then say, well, what can I do to change that? So people say, I'm not racist. And I say, well, good for you. Neither am I. What are you doing?
Right. Yeah.
Good for you. I'm not, you know what? Well, I'm not a murderer. Okay. How about that? Let's all talk about the things that we're not.
Right.
Let's all talk about, I've never killed a baby. Okay. All right. I've never kicked a puppy.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
Well, and that gets to, we are living in a racist system too. And that came to me through entertainment when we saw HBO's Watchmen early this year. And that was the first time I really absorbed the story of Tulsa. I'd been through high school and elementary school, American, Rhode Island grown, college, graduate. And I was stunned and just absolutely mortified that the bombing, the destruction of that middle-class Black community was not a normal part of my learning.
Right.
I just as mind-blowing. Now, only because Andalusia has only a limited time too, just like you. Sorry. So I want to bring her in and talk a little bit about another angle. And this is immigrants and migrants. We live in a world of mobility and flux. And Andalusia, you've covered other aspects of these issues too. But I was struck by this story that ran recently about Mexican indigenous, people living in New York City grappling with aspects of the coronavirus. Could you just give us a quick snapshot of how you what's your orientation toward these kinds of questions? And then we'll go forward from there.
Sure. So I'm a freelance journalist here in Mexico City, but I'm originally from New York City. And over the past 10 years of living here and working here, but also maintaining a connection with people in New York City. And I work a lot here in an area that's called the Mountains of Guerrero. And it's where there are thousands of migrants that have gone from that area to New York City, and they actually call it Tlapayork, which is the main city in this indigenous region is called Tlapa. And there's just such a tight connection there. So over the years, I've done different stories. One about how this town in the middle of nowhere has the best pizza in all of Mexico for me because it has New York style pizza. That's a much lighter story. But then also I saw there's a human rights organization that operates in this region called Tlachinoyan, and they were releasing press releases about how numerous indigenous migrants in New York City were dying of COVID. So I reached out to them and then was able to connect both with people in New York City and then in the mountains of Guerrero, which is one of the poorest regions in all of Mexico. It's very isolated and historically discriminated against, and most of the communities don't have any access to health services, or and if they needed to get to the hospital, it would be a 10-hour drive, and most people don't have any way to actually drive to get to them. So then it was many people for the past 20 years have migrated from this region to New York City, often working at pizza spots or other restaurants. And that when COVID hit, many of them do work in the service industry. So some still were working. Others, as in my story, I focus on one man, Sergio, and Juan, and that they actually they did stop working. The restaurants were closed and the floral shop where they worked, but they still, Juan did get COVID, and that they didn't really know what it was. They didn't have much information. And then it's that they face triple discrimination in hospitals, that it's not only a language barrier or perhaps someone's not speaking Spanish, that Spanish is their second language. So, and then that when they weren't sure about, going and getting the service, they didn't really understand what was happening with COVID. And then, of course, many of them are undocumented migrants, or the majority. Then they also fear going to a hospital and being deported. So in the end, that when when Martinez Garcia, he died in the hospital, you know, and then it was trying to navigate what happened. Did he really die of COVID? They didn't really fully understand. And then translating that to his family that live in a very isolated community. I was not able to go there partially because I live in Mexico City and I would represent a risk going to visit an indigenous community in the middle of nowhere now. But a few fellow journalists of mine that were closer in that region, they did and go and visit the family, and the family was completely dependent on the remittances that, you know, their son sent from New York, and that he was paying for the education of his daughter. And then they just know he got sick and really don't understand what's happening. But I think also it's not just that the story, you know, in any story we as journalists do, we can't always fit in everything that's happening. I was able to talk a little about what indigenous communities have done in Mexico actually to prevent the spread of COVID, because they know that they have such little resources to combat it, so that many communities actually completely closed off access. They put in road blockades, they have checkpoints. And I recently was able to travel to a different part of Guerrero, and there are indigenous communities that have what's community police forces, because they don't actually trust in the state police. And the community police have successfully helped prevent the spread of coronavirus. And so there were communities where there was no cases of COVID-19 at all. And that is because they had to completely block off, especially tourists, because many of these communities, this other area, it's a beach community. So they would not let anyone in, and they successfully controlled it, in comparison to Acapulco, where I also was working, which is has a peak now where hundreds of people are dying because people do keep coming in, and there's a lot of flow from other places where there's higher risk of the sspread of COVID.
Wow. So you're keeping busy, it sounds like, even though we're theoretically locked down.
I have to sign off and go, and we're working right now on a documentary on what it's like to be a photojournalist documenting COVID. So I have to go in 10 minutes and film part of this documentary.
Oh, interesting. So. Well, keep us in the loop on that. That sounds cool. Actually, Michael McGarrell was just talking about he just got a National Geographic Society grant recently to do some storytelling. So let's go to Guyana, and then obviously we'll get to Scott and Camila. Thank you for being part of this too. And just Andalusia and Chuck, you know, when you have to go, just wave and go, okay. Or hang on if you can. I guarantee you that probably half the people listening to this aren't aware of where Guyana is. So let's just start with that little reminder. And what are you up to?
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, wherever you may be watching from. Indeed, Guyana is one of those countries where people usually get confused, because they think Guyana is in Africa, because people are more familiar with Ghana. So I think they usually get mixed up. But Guyana is located on the South American continent. It's on the northeastern side of the South American continent. We are the only English-speaking country in South America, but we're also part of the Caribbean. We're considered part of the Caribbean as well. So we have the Caribbean culture and everything. So Guyana is located in South America. So I think that's the first place we should start. In Guyana, we have 9 nations of indigenous peoples, and I'm from the Patamona. There are three groups which live in the mountains, and that's the Patamona, Arcuna, and Akawayo. So I'm one of those group. But beyond that, Guyana is, I think, well, we call it land of many waters, because we have 3 really large rivers flowing straight through Guyana. But not just that. I think some of the good things about Guyana is that we still have quite a lot of forest cover. Over 80% of our country is still covered with forest, and it's one of the reasons why my job is so important as well, because we strive to ensure that those forests are kept standing. So that is Guyana. Guyana is also part of the Amazon Basin. And the Amazon Basin, there are 9 countries which make up the Amazon Basin. So we have Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia. So these are the countries that make up the Amazon Basin. The Amazon, the basin is connected to all of this. And I work with COICA, which is the Coordinator of Indigenous Peoples Organizations in the Amazon Basin. I work with them to I deal with the human rights and policies related to indigenous peoples. In my work, primarily, I fight for the rights of indigenous peoples to be protected and respected. Everything that we do comes back to that. Because we believe that as indigenous peoples, we have a role to play in terms of ensuring that climate change is mitigated, and we believe that we have a key role to play. We are the guardians of the forest. We have been the ones managing the forest for many generations, and we believe that the knowledge of our ancestors play a great role in terms of helping this happen. And therefore, what we think is that because of indigenous peoples, because we have been facing like so many types of dangers in this time, it has become difficult for us. There are so many threats which are impacting indigenous peoples, and we believe that if you're really interested in protecting the earth, in protecting our world, protecting Mother Nature, then you should pay interest in what is happening with indigenous peoples. Because whatever is happening to us is not just a threat to us, but it's a threat to the world. Because we are the guardians of the forest, and if we get affected in one way or the other, then it indirectly goes back to affecting you too. Most recently, we have seen the COVID pandemic, which has really threatened our populations. Our populations are being decimated. In Peru, for example, in many of our communities, people are just dying. In Ecuador, the same is happening. People are just dying. The reason for this, in Brazil, we have more than 5,000 indigenous peoples who would have already died in Brazil. And it is important that our governments pay attention to this. It is important that those who have the power to do things ensure that indigenous peoples, we have our basic human rights protected and respected, and certain things need to be put in place. Right? We need more access to medication. We need access to testing. We need access to screening. We need access to resources to ensure that our people continue to survive. For some, and we have seen, for example, in Brazil, where the president of Brazil has been very lax in terms of his response to the COVID epidemic. There are statements by some of his government officials which says that if the older people die out, then they will have to pay less pension. So it's a benefit for them in that way, which is truly not what it's supposed to be. Our governments should be looking out for our interests. They should be looking out to ensure that everything is safe with us. In my own country, Guyana, we have some situations right now. We have one of our largest indigenous peoples community, which the COVID rates has doubled, in within a few days. What this means for our population, we don't know as yet. We're just hoping that certain systems can be put in place to ensure that we receive adequate treatment, we receive adequate supplies for our health centers, because that's where they will have to be going. The people would have to go to the health center. So we need access to personal protective equipment for our medical workers. Right? In that village, 6 of the teachers were tested positive, and they're reopening school. Right? So it means that how can you reopen school, and the teachers will have to interact with the children. So it is important that indigenous peoples are consulted when decisions are being made for indigenous peoples. We need to be involved in any decision that will determine anything for us. It is important. I think it's the only way. Our rights to free, prior, and informed consent must be recognized, and it must be upheld. And it must be upheld by all. We need to be involved in decisions that affect us. So for us, it has not been an easy road. And I think what the COVID pandemic has done is to bring up and open up a lot more of what existed before. But it's just because of the pandemic now that we're seeing it more. And then coming back to what Chuck was talking about, the death of Floyd, it brought up a lot of issues. It was there all the time, but it's now one event, something caused it to all come up. And I believe that it is time that people recognize, hey, we have problems, we have issues, but we got to find solutions to them. In my country as well, right now, we're still awaiting an elections result. The elections were held 3 months ago. We're still waiting to see who's the president, right? But during that time, what has happened? we have seen a lot of racism. We have seen a lot of people fighting against each other. For what? To what end? Because they're affiliated to one party or the next. It brings up a lot of old wounds, and I think it's something we need to talk about more. It's something that we need to have more open discussions about, because it exists. As much as we try to say it doesn't exist, it exists. But then our leaders as well, they need to take a lead role in ensuring that people know, here what, let us address this. Let us find ways to address it. But they are the ones sometimes who are propagating it. They're the ones who
Right.
people against each other. And we need to change this. And
Yeah,
I always,
there's
we
a
need
situation.
to start a revolution as a people. We need to start a revolution to change it all. Let's not just depend on our leaders. We got to start from home, start from our families, from our communities, and we can make that change.
You're hitting on a couple of great points there. I want to swing to Camila and Scott, and then we can go back to those issues you raised. That context, the COVID-19 is spreading in Africa in so many different contexts on the ground. Andalusia, we'll see you again, okay?
Thank
Come
you so
back.
much. Would love to stay, but I'll check it out later.
No.
Thank you, and I'll check out all the work
Okay,
of all of
really
you.
great to have you on.
All right, great. Thanks. Bye.
Bye. What I've learned in keeping track of the pandemic in Africa is that, just as you said, there's some countries that have an election year, and this becomes just another vehicle to attack. The pandemic is actually the misinformation around it is more in the politics than in other things. Sounds like America, actually. It's funny how that happens. So Camila, you've written about a couple aspects of this. You're from Colombia. I assume you stay in touch with a lot of people down there. So what's your take on where we're at right now in this issue with indigenous vulnerability?
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear Michael right before me talk also about the Amazon Basin, because so I reported on a piece about an indigenous elder who passed away in Leticia. He was in the city of Leticia, which is in the southern tip of Colombia, which is part of the Amazon Basin. His name was Antonio Bolivar, and he was one of the first COVID-19 cases in a moment when the city was definitely not prepared. There's only a public hospital and a private hospital, and in that moment, given the lack of resources that doctors have in the public hospitals, they were all saying they were about to resign. So Antonio Bolivar got sick in that specific moment. The government of Colombia had been controlling more or less the pandemic in the Andean parts of Colombia. However, Leticia is really way more connected with a city like Manaus in Brazil, or a city like Iquitos in Peru. And in Manaus, as Mike already said, the cases in Brazil have been increasing dramatically, and especially in the Amazon region of Brazil. So Leticia, in a way, is more connected to all of the river towns that come from Brazil, from the east side. And that is, it is very clear that the way that the pandemic arrived to Leticia was not through the north of the country, given also that Leticia is not connected by roads to the rest of Colombia, but is way more connected to, again, the rest of the Amazon region. Yeah. So Antonio Bolivar, was an emblematic case because he's one of the few indigenous actors that is recognized in the country. The movie in which he was a lead actor called The Embrace of the Serpent, which I highly recommend. It's beautiful. It came out in 2016. Is about somebody, it's about an indigenous elder who's one of the last survivors of his community. And he is trying to recall the traditions of his people. And I talked to the director of the movie, Ciro Guerra, who talked about how much the character of Antonio Bolivar, called Caramacate, was inspired by the history of Antonio. And Antonio actually comes from an indigenous community that used to be huge at the beginning of the 20th century, and also another region of the Amazon Basin called the Putumayo, and rubber companies, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, enslaved many of the indigenous communities, including the Okaina the Guyana community of which Antonio Bolivar's ancestors were from. And so, in a way, not only, I mean, the movie is an homage to Antonio Bolivar's history, but his death was also kind of a moment of I mean, I hate to say an opportunity, but basically the article was a way to remember that many of the indigenous communities of the Amazon, especially the Colombian Amazon, but not just that, have been already victims of so much violence, in which, you know, we are in a moment in which we're talking again about we're talking loudly about the history of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and racism. And so the pandemic, even though it's been terrible, it's just a new chapter in a very long history of violence. And I think that was what I was getting at. Right now, Leticia is still in a very complicated situation. And in general, indigenous peoples in Colombia, they know about at least more than 900 cases of COVID-19 confirmed cases. They have also been taking measures in each of the territories, especially, which is easier to be made in areas where they're not urban, they're rural, in which indigenous communities have control over their territory to control the flow of people. And in some cases, I was just talking yesterday to a group in Putumayo who basically decided long ago, by beginning of March, to isolate themselves. And they do have one phone with Wi-Fi connection, which is the reason why I was able to connect, that they have been completely isolated from, which is, of course, a form of protection, but I don't know how long it will be sustainable.
It's so interesting. Hey, Chuck, you're waving. You got to go.
I got to go now, and then I'm really sorry that I have to go. This was
no.
great,
we're all wedging things into our lives.
I just want to say one thing, because Michael spoke to revolution, and when you said that word, it sparked me that, you know, there's revolution, which means a wide-reaching and dramatic change. And the other revolution is the completion of a cycle, just going around. And when you said that, something just popped into my head and said, let's be revolutionary, not cyclist. So,
yeah, you know, I'm not sure I've ever thought about that.
It just popped into my head when he said that. So, vive la revolution, okay?
Yeah, the
See you
active
guys.
one, not the circular one. Take care, Chuck.
Exactly.
I'll have you back. I want to have you back on here, man.
You know, at any time, man. You know where to find me.
All right, great.
Take care.
That's nice. So, speaking of revolutions and cycles, Scott Wallace, you and I, my hair is maybe not as gray, but you know, I started on this in the 80s, and there are aspects of this. I remember last burning season last year in the Amazon, you know, everyone was saying the worst ever. And I was like, wait a minute. I was there in 89, writing at the peak of the burning season of an era that had this 1,000 deaths, 1,000 killings of people like Chico Mendez. And so both the deforestation and the murder rates were really high. And now we have Bolsonaro, who's kicking things back into gear, but it's very different. But at the same time, there's, as Chuck said, there is a cyclical aspect. And this is the same for what we saw with the race, Watts riots, you know, 68, LA, 92, and now. And you think, I don't think we're doomed to just be repeating ourselves. I'd like each one of you to get at this, but Scott, could you reflect a little bit on what you just wrote recently about COVID-19? Even that's a part of a cycle going back to Columbus. You know, this is not the first pandemic. We destroyed the human ecology of the Americas when Europeans came west. So what's on your mind in that context?
I mean, when you think about it, actually, you know, clearly the indigenous peoples of the Americas, North and South America, Central America, suffered a horrific genocide starting 500 years ago. Most of the deaths and the displacement of indigenous people, certainly they were faced with violence, but a lot of the violence came in the form of epidemic disease. Even today in the Amazon, you still have, isolated so-called uncontacted tribes. And I've been on expedition through the land of one such tribe in the deep jungles of the Javari Valley in Brazil. And, near Leticia, as a matter of fact, you have to get into the Javari Valley. You go through Leticia Tabatinga on the Brazil side. The phenomenon that Camila was just describing in terms of the enslavement of indigenous people in that part of the Amazon in the late 19th century, early 20th century is, very germane to what's going on now for a number of reasons. But one is that these so-called isolated tribes that are still holding forth in the depths of the rainforest, these are basically the descendants of the survivors of those slaving raids and massacres, the people who managed to get away and regroup in the most impenetrable redoubts of the forest and reconstitute themselves as peoples. And we, there's often this notion that so-called uncontacted tribes are, have no experience with the modern world and don't know anything about the modern world. But in fact, they themselves are a phenomenon of the modern world, forced into this kind of isolation because of epidemic disease and violence. So, and these are groups that today, with the pandemic going on, as long as they are able to maintain their isolation, hopefully will survive. But one of the biggest problems right now in Brazil, not only is this pandemic moving into the deep Amazon and into indigenous communities, but the people who are not isolating are, illegal loggers, miners, those who are, very much keyed into the profit-making machinery of the global economy. They are taking advantage of this moment actually to move deeper into protected areas in the Amazon and into indigenous territories in the Amazon. And you have a government in Brasilia, Bolsonaro's government, who is, they're very much giving a green light to these kinds of activities. So it's, it's the latest chapter, as Camila said, in a very long history of colonialism, imperialism, racism, and I think it's a particularly dangerous one right now, where because you have this confluence of factors with a hostile government, a government openly hostile to the indigenous peoples of Brazil at the time of this pandemic, and the very difficult conditions that prevail in a lot of the indigenous territories in Brazil. So it's a time that concerns me a great deal. And you mentioned Paulino Hayek, who died this week. He was a brilliant strategist and a really important person in the history of the environmental movement. Unfortunately, was kind of taken out of the picture in 1992 by a very unfortunate incident that resulted in his being charged with raping a non-indigenous woman, which those charges, that's a whole other story. But wow. Clearly a lot of what happened then was a organized conspiracy to take him out of the picture and to stick a knife in the heart of the indigenous and environmental movement at that time.
Yeah, it certainly did. Although maybe, Michael, you could talk briefly about COICA and the other basin-wide initiatives that are trying to give a communal voice, a bit of a coordinated voice to indigenous peoples around the regions.
Thank you, Andy. Yes, and COICA is the coordinator of indigenous peoples organizations in the Amazon Basin. And the whole intention of Koika is to really create a platform, a space where communities across the Amazon basin can come together and discuss issues, and also to bring these issues as a collective to the world. Koika as a body has representation at different spaces, which we can amplify the voices of the local organization, local based organizations and countries. So we know that the Amazon basin is a critical area, is a critical spot for the world for many purposes. And one of those purposes is that the Amazon basin is considered the lung of the earth. We have so much forest there that it processes so much carbon dioxide. And as indigenous peoples, this forest that stands in the Amazon basin, it's our home, right? The forest means so much to us. The forest, it's our home. The forest provides for us our livelihoods. We get our food. We get our resources, other non-timber resources that we use. We get so much from the forest. It's like our supermarket, basically. We can get what we want. We have medicine. We have anything we can get from the forest. So not only that it's our home, but like I said, it provides essential services to the world. And this is why I'm saying, and why I said earlier that us feeling threatened, our indigenous peoples being endangered, is not just an endangerment for us as a people, but it's an endangerment for the world, because affecting us will ultimately affect the world, because we are the guardians of the forest. Like I said earlier, we are the guardians of the forest. We live in the forest. It's our home. It's our supermarket. It's our pharmacy. It's everything to us. And we want to ensure that it continues to keep standing. And as a result of this, Koika has come together as a grouping of these indigenous peoples organizations from around the Amazon basin to have this one platform that we can operate from. Because right across the Amazon basin, you will find our leaders are being criminalized, our leaders are being assassinated, they're being murdered, just because we are fighting for our rights. We're just fighting for their basic human rights to be protected and respected. However, it's a threat to governments. It's a threat to industries which want to come into our lands to conduct mining activities, logging activities, and other type of activities. So collectively, we believe that we can have a better position to operate from, because as individuals, multinational companies can take us out easily. Governments can take us easily. However, if they recognize that we are coming from a bigger front, we're coming with a bigger group, then the chances of our voices being heard is better. So Koika was set up to really address some of these issues. And Koika has been in existence for over 37 years now. And, we continue to represent the interests of indigenous peoples around the Amazon basin. But not just that, we have even gone beyond the Amazon basin now, in that we collaborate with like Aman, for example, in Indonesia. We coordinate with organizations in Mesoamerica. We coordinate, with organizations further down south in the Andes. So we do quite a lot. And we've been trying to ensure that our voices, indigenous peoples, are heard, and they are heard at the right levels, including the United Nations and other world governments. So Koika is there as a collective group of non-governmental organizations who are working together in the interest of indigenous peoples.
And you said you got a National Geographic grant to do some storytelling, and I know you're part of If Not Us, Then Who, which is one of the great efforts I've seen. I think Ford Foundation and others support to give voice to indigenous communities directly. The more I love being a journalist so much of my life. And I'm sure Camila and Scott have that same sense of the privilege we've had to look into other people's lives. But at the same time, in more recently, the last 10 years, I've gotten much more focused on what can I do to enable storytelling or enable communication impact in others. So I like enterprises like If Not Us, Then Who, because it's doing that kind of thing. So what's your project?
Yeah, so I have been doing some work with, If Not Us, Then Who. They're one of our partners, and one of the groups which help us to amplify our voices. And we believe that collaboratively, we'd be able to do so much more And we truly appreciate groups like If Not Us Then Who, the Amazon Watch, National Geographic, Ford Foundation, and those who make it possible for things to happen. So recently, I received a grant from the National Geographic Society to do some storytelling. Basically, what the story I want to tell is the story of our people, the story of our lands, and how we are connected to those lands. Guyana, it's over 83,000 square miles, and many of the landmarks like mountains, rivers, and other things around Guyana carry indigenous people's names. It was us, the indigenous peoples, who would have named those things. And our story of the land has never been told. And we want to tell others about this because many times people usually have this perception that we, as indigenous peoples, we want too much land and we can't do anything with this land. Develop land. And
some guy named Bolsonaro tries to make that point sometimes.
Yes, and indigenous peoples are, trying to keep the land in a state which is not developed. All these things people say. However, our way of life is different from others, and we need that land space. And we also believe, and multiple studies have shown that where indigenous peoples live, the land is kept in a better state. The forests are kept standing. The biodiversity continues to exist. The environment is in a better state. And we want to ensure, and we are encouraging government to say, you know what, recognize our lands, recognize our titles, and you will be contributing to mitigating the effects of climate change and other things. But in terms of the story, we want to tell a story about these lands. We want to tell a story about the mountains, how the mountains got their name. How are we connected to the land? Why is it that we're trying to ensure that this area is remains in a pristine state? We want to tell that story. We want to tell these stories because Guyana has just started producing oil, and with oil comes a lot of more resources. With more resources, governments may want to, as what they call, develop the interior by putting roads into places that there may not have been good roads before. What does this mean for us? It means that miners will have access now to areas they have not had before. Loggers will have access to those areas as well. And of course, they will bring in their heavy equipment and continue what they're doing. For example, right now, the mining is considered an essential service. Even though Guyana has a curfew because of the COVID pandemic, mining is considered an essential service. So mining continues,
interesting, right?
While other things are not happening. So, these are concerns for us, and we believe that with more resources, with the oil coming, you have more resources, then they may want to do more. So we want to tell a story of our land so that maybe people can really understand why is it that we're trying to protect these lands? Why is it that we're trying to ensure that these lands are recognized in legal titles? Because currently, as it is, it's easier to get a mining concession compared to us trying to get a legal title to our lands. Within weeks, you can get a mining concession. But for us to get recognition, title, and demarcated, it can take up to many years. There are still communities who are waiting for many years for their titles and demarcation. However, mining concessions are being granted, which is a fast process. You can get it in a jiffy. And if you should have a look at our map, the mining concessions cover quite a lot of Guyana, right? So we want to tell the story, and we will tell it by using videos. We want to use maps as well, because sometimes people don't know where you're talking about because we have different names to different mountains and things like that. So while we're telling you about it, we can show you visually on a map as well where we're talking about, so you have an understanding of what Guyana is, because Guyana is pretty huge still.
Sounds like a great project. Make sure to stay in touch when it's coming together. We can do another session.
It is. It will be great, because one of the other things I want to tell you,
well,
Andy,
I just want to fit in Camila a little bit more, and then we'll circle back to you if that's okay. So Camila, what's on your list? Are you going to be circling back to these kinds of stories more, or what are you thinking going forward? When you think about where we're at and where we need to be, and then as a journalist, how you approach that.
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm trying to approach a group that is, as I was saying, in Putumayo, that has been isolating, and at the same time has been in an area that has been afflicted for many years already by Colombian armed conflict. Their territory, for example, has been full of landmines. I'm working on a documentary filmmaker on that project, which should come out next week. So I'll share.
Wow.
Is
there a website or anything for it, or is this
No.
just going to come out?
No, I'll share it. I'll make sure to share it.
Great.
I have been thinking, though, to connect a little bit with the conversation we had at the beginning and to move forward in journalism, I think, in publishing, that the conversation around George Floyd's death, Juneteenth, the protests, has been about, in terms of policy, about defunding the police. And a few people have raised this, but I think there's more to be done about the experience that many Indigenous communities have fought for to have their own police guard in their territory and exclude the military and the state police. So in many cases those cases have been successful. And I do think that many times for the conversation to move forward here on how is this defunding the police project possible? How can it be done? I think that there's a lot to learn from the efforts that Indigenous groups have done to control the state police, the government's police, and to have their own guard. And I actually think in this pandemic, a few of the territories, again, mostly the rural territories like Putumayo, in the case of Colombia, another area called Cauca, where there has been strong activism for many years. And it's an area that has also been afflicted by the armed conflict. And there has been a very strong Indigenous guard who has been able to keep away from the territory not only the armed groups, in the specific case of Colombia, but the state military. And I think that is, this is a good moment to connect a lot of histories of what we're living here right now in the U.S. and also the struggles in the Amazon. And I think that's one of the points where I would like to see more. Or I would like to keep looking at more.
You raised an interesting point there, if I got it correctly, a little earlier when you said you had interviewed someone in a place where they had an internet connection. I have this vision in my head, and this relates to what Michael was just saying too. And maybe this goes to Scott's journalism professor side. There's this website, radio.garden. So I'm showing it right here, where you can basically scroll through the world and you can listen to live radio in Algeria or Afghanistan. And I love it. I can't remember how I stumbled on it, but I kept thinking, wouldn't it be cool, especially now in COVID time, where people do have connectivity, where you could, whether you're a journalist or student, you can connect directly with the community. Just as you see these little dots, of course, you see North America is thousands of radio stations, and they're scattered. But those could be, why are they just radio stations? In other words, anywhere where you can have a connection, where journalists could find and talk to people on the ground, and where that story, self-generated, community-generated stories can kind of be posted. It feels like there's an opportunity there that hasn't fully been expressed yet. When I was at National Geographic Society, actually, I was pushing this idea. And Michael, I don't know, do people have an easy way to connect with your community if they're looking for them? I know you do a lot of output, right? You're doing YouTube videos, but is it a place that's discoverable in that way?
Yeah, one of the challenges of our communities is the connectivity.
Yeah, of course.
We have had programs which been trying to bring like satellite internet to communities. However, the bandwidth has always been the issue. So we have to find more innovative ways. My region, for example, in the North Pakram is where I'm from, we do not have a radio station, and you have several communities there. So maybe it's one of the things that can be really useful and helpful in that area. not just radio stations. We don't even have like connectivity by mobile phones. So it's very difficult at times to communicate. But now with some internet access, you will have some amount of connectivity, but not as much as we would want.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll be getting there. I think it's a frontier that should be pursued. So a more connected planet is a more empathetic planet potentially. People can, if they don't know you're there, they don't know you're a human being, they're less likely to care about your situation. I think maybe there's possibilities here we can still work on. Scott, I don't know what you feel about all that. I mean, you and I are both started out as traditional pad, paper, camera reporter types.
I mean, it's fascinating to think about that kind of technology and where it could go. I feel, like a bit of a Luddite when it comes to all these new technologies, and when I'm sort of still sort of like paper and pen, and
I bet you still have a film camera around.
Yeah, actually, up behind me, you might be able to see a bunch of them on the shelf over my head. Yeah. So it is fascinating to consider. I'm really interested in the idea, by the way, a little bit off, coming back to something that was raised before about, indigenous policing of their territories. That's something I've been working on a bit in Brazil. Actually, one of the problems there is there's such a lack of governance, right, and a failure on the part of authorities to enforce the law, that indigenous groups are raising their own volunteer, groups to patrol their territories, and they're often outgunned and outmanned, and can be very dangerous. So we'll see what happens with that going forward. Yeah. Thank you, by the way, for introducing me to Radio Garden. I'll definitely be
it's kind of mesmerizing. Camila, you had a question or a thought?
Yeah, I wanted to add something on the possibility of radio and connecting with the Amazon basin. In my case of Leticia, I did find that yes, the connection can be hard, but at the same time, there have been already for many years, a lot of people have been making efforts to have a Wi-Fi connection, especially a WhatsApp app, and that has been fantastic. I was in a very tiny town of the Amazon called Puerto Nariño. I was able to connect to a doctor who could send me, even if we couldn't have a long conversation on the phone, who could send me photos, who could send me videos. Leticia, also Antonio Oliver, actually used to work with a film school, mostly people in their 20s, in their 30s, who have been doing a lot of things, and can share a lot of videos and can share a lot of testimonies. I mean, and they are ready to do alliances with journalists. I mean,
well, I'd love to find out more about that. My initiative at Columbia University is, I think our main role that I see is filling gaps. We're doing projects right now that are trying to make a better relationship between journalists and sources of expertise. Global Press is this international network of female journalists developed from the ground up in countries that are mostly underreported, Rwanda and Congo, and we're working to connect them with better sources of data. So we're, maybe we should talk about that. I try to make every one of these conversations end up with something to do that can move the needle a little bit. And I think this might be one of those things. I'd like to stay in touch with Michael McGarrell and with you, Camila Osorio, and people in Leticia, if we can. If we can help with some of that, that'd be great. Scott, we're at the...
By the way, I would just want to add, WhatsApp is amazing. I get a lot of my information about what's going on in the indigenous communities in Brazil from a WhatsApp app group that I'm, subscribed to.
Yeah, same thing for me with disaster risk and all through sub-Saharan Africa. It's the main portal.
Yeah.
So we're at the end of an hour here, and this has been a long week, and it's a long weekend ahead on Sunday. My Sunday session, which is always focused on the arts and hearts. more than the hard issues we face during the week, is a special poetry slam with in collaboration with the Wick Poetry Center at Kent State University and with the Earth Essex Center at Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary. And on Wednesday, we're going to do a session with on an important issue: the small nonprofits that make cities function and resilient are kind of invisible. So, and then Friday again, we'll be back here to talk about the issues of the week with journalists. Anyone here who wants to come back, you're welcome. We were focused pretty deeply on things like the vaccines and the science for the first few weeks, and now I'm broadening out to some of these broader social issues. So just thank you to all for participating, and to Chuck Nice and Andalusia and the others who were here earlier, and to Michael McGarrell in Guyana. Camila, good luck with that project. I want to see the film. And Scott Wallace in Connecticut, good to see you. It's good to see. It's good just to talk, to connect, even digitally, even through this weird portal we call the internet.
Great to meet everyone today. Thank you for inviting me on.
And this project is a production of the Earth Institute's new initiative on communication and sustainability, which I founded and direct, and I'm trying to grow and sustain, just like everything else. I'm Andy Revkin. Please stay in touch. Share this when it's done. As soon as I click done, there's an archive video on 3 different platforms that you can share with friends who want to learn more about journalism focused on Indigenous issues and how we get to a better place than where we are. And it's a day to honor the end of slavery in theory, and now we have to work to pursue the end of racism in all of its forms around us. So thank you for tuning in. This is Sustain What?